Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition in WinMagic's Speed webinar series. Today, we will be discussing phishing. It's more dangerous than you thought. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today, especially those of you coming from overseas. We really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your normal business, outside of normal business hours to attend our discussion. As always, I have some logistics to get through before we begin. So as per usual, today's webinar will be recorded and a link will be delivered to you via the follow-up email that comes out approximately 24 hours after the end of today's presentation. I want to encourage the audience to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. That way we can use your feedback to continue to deliver high quality content. Please feel free to drop a few questions in the Q&A box below and we will do our best to get to them today. If not, we will reach out individually after today's presentation. To get the most value out of today's discussions, please answer the polls as they come up throughout the presentation, although I believe there is only one for us today. With that being said, I will get into our speakers. Today's panel will consist of two familiar faces to you guys, that being Gary McCracken, our CISO and VP of Technology here at WinMagic, and Rahul Kumar, our VP of Marketing and Sales at WinMagic. As well, myself, my name is Graham, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. In terms of a topic introduction, before we go any further, I just wanted to leave you with with this statement. Today's media cycle around cybersecurity focus heavily on threats like ransomware and the newest, biggest data breaches that have occurred in any given year. Immediately recognizable names such as SolarWinds or the Colonial Pipeline attack, even for example, are just a few of these. However, these days, very few individuals are really discussing the root enabler of many of these headline-worthy issues, mainly phishing attacks and their various vectors. I have two stats that I want to leave you with as we get into today's discussion. First, targeted spear phishing consisted of 91% of successful data breaches in 95% of all enterprise networks, according to a Deloitte study. And as well, combining this fact with some results and data from the FBI IC3 report for the year 2020 is that there were over 240,000 victims of phishing-related attacks. With these two stats in mind, you can clearly see that this is a discussion that organizations really cannot afford to go without having. From here, I will turn it over to Gary.
Thanks, Graham. Let's just do a little recap on phishing. I'm sure most people know this already, but phishing is a type of social engineering where the attacker sends a message designed to trick a human victim, so it's a human victim they're trying to trick, into revealing sensitive information, and that could be a social insurance number, but often it's a username and password, account credentials, or it's trying to trick a human again into installing something like malware, say for ransomware. And Graham already mentioned, there's sort of two major types of phishing. There's a bunch of subcategories, but there's the generic phishing, which tends to be messages like, "Dear user, please go onto your PayPal account and type your credentials in." And those are a lot easier for individuals and for software to detect. And then there's spear phishing. Spear phishing is when the attacker will research the victim and customize and tailor the attack to them. So it'll have probably their organization's name in there, maybe their boss's name in there, certainly their name, and it leads the receiver to trust the message much more than a normal phishing message. And they're much more likely, as the stats show, to do what they're asked to do or tricked to do in the spear phishing message. Thanks, Graham.
Awesome. Now that we've kind of touched this last little bit here, Rahul, can you provide an example of the relationship between phishing and, let's say, a little bit more of a headline-worthy attack vector, such as like business email compromise, for example?
Thank you, Graham. And this is kind of interesting. And thanks, Gary, for sharing sharing about phishing and especially spear phishing. But before we go there, let me pull out our first poll, and like you said, Grant, the only poll here. So and this is let me put that question in context, right? From a phishing standpoint or any kind of threat attack standpoint, what do you think, which type of attack causes most financial loss to the victims? So I'll give you guys possibly 10-15 seconds to answer the question, and then we'll look at the results of the poll here. Okay. Let's see.
Okay, we're sitting and just give it, it's taking a few seconds for them to come through here with me. Rahul.
Yep.
All right, looks like we've got some answers coming through here. Okay, so just pull there. I'm sharing the results.
Okay.
This isn't everyone in the audience, but we've got enough to prove a little bit of a point here.
Yeah, so it's not everybody in the audience, but again, okay, so the 40% of the audience really said ransomware and phishing in it and its variant. 20% said business email compromise. So now this is good, right? Because a lot of people here think that ransomware is the biggest one, or even phishing and its variant. Remember, the report, the IC3 report from FBI really called the answer from there is business email compromise. But you may not be too far off the cuff there, because business email compromise really leads from phishing. Or phishing is a big enabler for business email compromise, and we'll talk about that a bit more. But let's first understand what business email compromise is, and it's not as famous as ransomware, so to say. So let me explain what business email compromise is, and a lot of you may know it already. Business email compromise are attack forms which use email fraud to attack commercial, government, or even non-profit organizations to achieve a specific outcome which negatively impacts an organization, mostly financial. Business email compromise typically involves an individual impersonating an authority figure and asking an employee with targeted business for sensitive data, money, or both. A traditional BEC scam impersonates a foreign business supplier. Attackers either compromise the business email account at the supplier or spoof the supplier's email address and style. So essentially, they often use a legitimate email account. So you wouldn't know if it is Rahul who's sending out an email, or his essentially it will, or somebody else. They have really taken over the account. It really works from an account takeover standpoint. The attackers then email the target, usually an employee who's authorized to make the funds transfer. The message is crafted to closely resemble a legitimate wire request, even down to the timing. For example, saying if this invoice, for example, is due at a particular time, they will send you an email from the authority who's after taking over that account at that particular time. So it doesn't seem like a fraudulent activity. Let me give you an example. For example, Toyota lost $37 million in a BEC scam in 2019. And that's a huge sum, $37 million, where one of their employees in their European headquarters, I think in Sweden, wired $37 million to a foreign account. Again, exactly in the same fashion as I talked to you about, to a supplier, where the payment was due, but they sent it to an entirely different account, which was fraudulent, of course. Right? There are several incidents, right? There are several incidents of this nature that have surfaced, making BEC a huge issue for organizations, especially in the US. Right? In the US, BEC in 2020 accounted for losses worth $1.8 billion. And let's put it in comparison, the second most expensive cyber attack type within the US was $600 million. So it's already 3 times more expensive. There are a lot of studies, of course, because of the size and the volume of the losses on phishing and leading into BEC. I'm gonna leave you guys with some major stats, right, from that particular report. It said 44% of the companies witnessed in the US when they did the survey over 50 attacks, right? 50 phishing attacks to get to compromise. And the most common thing in terms of the subject line of those compromised emails was urgent invoice. Again, on the lines of those that example that I gave you, or the Toyota example, urgent invoice. Over 60% of these organizations lost data, and close to half, 47% of them, were infested with ransomware at a later time. So ransomware is big, but if you look at the stats and even this report from FBI, ransomware or rather the other way around, BEC is seen to be 62 times more lucrative for a cyber hacker than ransomware, even though ransomware is more publicized. And again, there is background and the background of phishing within ransomware itself.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Rahul, for that explanation. That personally cleared up a few confusions I had for me and misunderstandings I had based off of what I've been reading in cybersecurity media over the last little while. That perfectly feeds right into my next question for you guys today, which is, what does a more advanced headline-worthy like ransomware that is headline-worthy attack like ransomware that is a little bit more complicated than phishing have to do with phishing?
I'll take that one, Graham. And for sure, I mean, I monitor the security news, and ransomware has a lot of the headlines. But let's digress a little bit and talk about how the cyber kill chain. So in an attack, it is often in many stages over time. And the stages can be things like reconnaissance, lateral movement, data exfiltration. And in each stage of the attack, different vulnerabilities are exploited, and they move the attack further and further ahead. Now, these attacks aren't something that's usually happened in a day or even a week. Often they take over the course of days or weeks or months, or sometimes or even years before they're discovered. Mm-hmm. Now, phishing is usually not the end goal in the attack chain. Rather, it's a tool used early on to set up the circumstances so that the end goal can be achieved. For business email compromise, phishing can be used to steal the email account credentials so that the attacker then can start their chain of fraudulent messages to convince the victim to, well, wire transfer money. Or for ransomware, often it is also trick them to install malware, but installing malware just on the local machine that the guy clicked on sometimes is not enough. And it's often better to get account credentials so that then in the later parts of the attack chain, they can move laterally, get more credentials, more data, until eventually they have all the data. And then that can lead to these headlines like, you've probably heard of this one, Colonial Pipeline CEO confirms $4.4 million ransomware payment. And if you haven't, and that's mainstream, that's what as mainstream as it gets. And if you haven't heard of that one, you don't read the mainstream news, maybe you've been at a gas station in North Carolina or Virginia and found there was no gas. Well, that's what the end result of that ransomware attack was. So it had real world impacts on real people. So the ransomware attack itself, again, as you probably know, is a type of malware. And the intention is to get access to as much data as possible, and probably at all, encrypt it with a key that only the attacker has, and then only unlock that data if the ransom is paid, usually in Bitcoin or some kind of cryptocurrency. Ransomware more recently has been morphing into, well, we'll give you your data back, but if you don't pay the ransom, we're going to reveal your data to the world, which even scares some people even more. But how did they get infected with that malware in the first place? In a report from Deloitte, they said phishing is the #1 delivery vehicle for ransomware. The main purpose of most phishing emails today is to deliver directly or indirectly some form of ransomware. So the indirectly are things like credential phishing, because that's a step in the attack chain. I think this is a little bit more highlighted in the health sector from CoFence's annual phishing report, shows that more than half of phishing emails are designed to steal user credentials, and only 12% are direct malware payloads. So that's the connection to phishing for ransomware. It's the first part of the attack chain where credentials are stolen.
Awesome. Thank you, Gary. Outside of ransomware per se, could we maybe get a little bit more specific and use an actual headline example that is likely to be related or pretty much related, such as maybe the SolarWinds attack, for example?
Well, SolarWinds is somewhat related, and let me explain why.
Sure.
So first of all, SolarWinds attack been dominating the headlines. Probably it even overtook from ransomware for a while, since back in 2019. Sophisticated team of hackers with probable ties to a nation state were able to get into SolarWinds network and insert malware into their software updates. And then those updates went out to over 18,000 organizations, including private organizations, federal agencies, even the DoD. So that was a supply chain attack. And on the surface, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with phishing. But there's two sides to that. You know, what happens after that software got into those 18,000? Not all of them, bad things didn't happen, all of them, but some of them, they weren't well protected, and that software ended up moving laterally and morphing into many types of different types of attacks. And there was some credential theft perhaps after.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary. That does clear it up for me. But why is a supply chain attack, such as SolarWinds, for example, how is that relevant when it's clear that this attack is clearly more than just phishing?
Well, after the attack happens, of course, the forensics guys get involved. And the first thing they do at the beginning was line up the usual suspects. And those are stolen credentials, brute force password guessing, or compromised third-party software. They said, well, you know, at the beginning, they said, well, this is a very sophisticated nation state attack. It probably was some kind of very sophisticated spear phishing, social engineering, something like that. Mm-hmm. But as time went on, they started to unwind the story. There was the congressional hearings, and the former CEO revealed that, well, you know, we did have a password called SolarWinds 123 on our server. So that seemed to be a little bit more likely than a sophisticated spear phishing attack. And then Representative Katie Porter, she summed up everybody's reactions to that by saying, I've got a stronger password than SolarWinds 123 to stop my kids from watching too much YouTube on their iPad. So, I mean, at that point, they said, well, probably somebody just guessed the password. But then even later on, they found that SolarWinds 123, that password, had been posted in plain text on GitHub for more than a year. So if you're looking at, you know, the most likely thing is probably they found that password in plain text.
Wow, yeah, it certainly is a lesson in terms of purely just password maintenance and maintaining a proper password system throughout an organization. But for organizations that are really looking to remain secure against this initial phishing breach, in order to protect themselves from further onsets resulting from that phishing breach, what does this really imply?
Well, so in this instance, well, they originally thought it was probably spear phishing. Probably not, because it had more to do with weak, well-known passwords. Mm-hmm. But I think in short, the same mitigations that apply against phishing and spear phishing also apply for just against plain old weak passwords and password leakage. And so we'll have a little bit more on that later, what those mitigations are that would cover all of those.
Okay, awesome, thanks. I really appreciate that. Then to me, that's very concerning to hear that, especially given the volume of organizations that were exposed by various different elements of that attack. I think that brings me right to my next topic that I wanted to touch on for us today, and that's on the relationship of the recent updates that have come from the president of the United States. specifically. On May 2nd of 2021, it marked a significant change for the landscape of cybersecurity with POTUS's cybersecurity executive order, making headlines front and center in both mainstream media outlets and cybersecurity channels alike. Can you give us a quick recap about what this means and what this could apply for phishing?
Let me take this one, and this is a very interesting conversation point, Graham, and timely one as well. What it has been 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks on this. Let me quote what the core of this entire executive order says. It says the federal government must improve its efforts to identify, deter, protect against, detect, and respond to these actions and actors. Now, this executive order has set a significant mandate for all federal agencies, especially the civilian ones and their contractors, to improve their own cybersecurity capabilities and posture, and put significant steps towards reporting of cybersecurity incidents for both government agencies and the enterprise, private enterprise alike. The issues tackled by this particular executive order is far-reaching. It's an 8,000 document, but for this particular conversations, I'm going to touch upon 3 major pieces. Let me all software purchase, and that across the government, it really creates a bit of a playbook or standard operating procedure for all. And I want to touch upon investigate and learn. And we talked about in the previous part where Gary was talking about learning from what has happened in the marketplace to learn from major cyber attacks.
Wow.
Now, this is something that happens in all major commercial organizations and also in some federal agencies. Again, this puts together a process and makes it fundamental to the is the order to enforce or use multi-factor authentication and encrypt data at rest and in motion. Again, sounds very standard. There's no rocket science in there if you look at the security posture, but the president's signature is expected, and I'm sure will push the envelope significantly in that direction. Congress, I'm sure, will make provisions and give them budgets, but solutions which can do both encryption and MFA together should have a significant advantage there.
Oh, okay, I see. So let's narrow this very large scope and wide scoping mandate down towards the adoption of encryption technology, like you said, that has both MFA and encryption with MFA together. So can you tell us what this really means for protecting data from an attack vector such as phishing through these methods?
Sure, Graham, and I agree. This is something that we need to do and kind of break this down. This is a large order, right? Again, the executive order included 2 central mandates to protect against attack vectors such as phishing or device loss. The first one is the mandatory use of encryption for data at rest. This means that agencies must adopt encryption at all endpoints, whether it is native encryption or a third-party encryption management solution to manage encryption across all operating systems, Windows, Mac, Linux, and all. That way, data at rest is secure and only accessible to authorized individuals. And one solution to really take care of the whole infrastructure, cuts down the cost of management, and also makes it easy to manage. The second one, the second element of this particular mandate I wanted to touch upon is the emphasis that is placed on making multi-factor authentication, or MFA as we call it in the industry, mandatory for everybody to use. Well, I'm not surprised really to see it included because a lot of government agencies use PIP cards and everything. I'm excited to see its inclusion inclusion for mandatory use. Where it becomes very interesting is combining MFA and encryption together to make sure there is MFA available at pre-boot, which is for encryption, and also in operating system for various scenarios like Windows Logon or VPN or Office 365, especially in use. And there are multiple use cases like MFA for Linux encryption or using the currently used PIV cards by the agencies to use for pre-boot and stuff like that. Yeah, there are multiple use cases there.
Awesome. That's good to hear. Thank you for taking the time to really boil that down for us so we can really learn what this means, especially for protecting against phishing. For my next question, I know most organizations would refer to their IT admins for this, but at a high level, can we go over some plausible solutions or risk mitigation strategies to help reduce the risk of phishing attacks in a specific organization?
I'll take that one. So, I mean, first of all, there is no one thing you can do to give you 100% protection against pretty well anything. It's about layers of protection and defense in depth. Phishing is a social engineering attack. It's an attack against people, and people may be your last line of defense in some instances. So it's only logical to prepare your people, give them some tools, give them security awareness training. With that, it's a strong component of training with phishing. Train them to recognize the phishing attacks and what to do when they receive with them. Maybe do simulations on an ongoing basis. And it's not a one-time thing, it's over the course of months and years because attacks come and come. But there's more to it than that. Even according to SANS, even after security awareness training and multiple simulations, you can still have a 5% click rate on generic phishing attacks. And spear phishing attacks are much worse and much harder to resist. The one thing I remember from a SANS course I took many years ago was that anybody can be tricked or fall to a spear phishing attack if it's well executed enough. So there are technical things you need to do also. Well, of course, there's your email gateway, because that's where a lot of phishing comes in. Put the protections in there to filter out spam and emails, and certainly all the generic ones a lot of them should be caught. Anti-malware on the input side and on the output side. The output side, I mean, is if it does get through, and the user clicks something they shouldn't. Now, 12% of phishing is malware, so we should be able to do something with that. But 50% of phishing emails seek credential theft. And this is where MFA comes in my opinion, the best technical protection that there is against phishing and credential theft.
Okay.
But all MFA isn't equal. Some MFA, like SMS text messages or one-time password, they're still susceptible to phishing. And even SMS text messages have even been restricted by NIST. So the best type of MFA is something like FIDO. It's a standard, that's good. And it has anti-phishing built right into the protocol. It can be used as a second factor for SaaS sites like Salesforce as a second step. So even if the password is phished, the second factor resists it. Or even better in passwordless authentication for things like Microsoft Office, where there's no password to phish. So I know we're running out of time, I'll leave you one message here is FIDO MFA is one of the best mitigations available to protect against credential theft via phishing.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Gary. It seems that there's a lot that organizations can do, whether it be to protect against the human side or the technical side as well, to include those various mitigation strategies like MFA or something even as simple as email gateways, like you said. We have had 2 questions come in here today. We'll see how far we get in terms of time, because I know we are over time. So I appreciate you guys sticking around with us to at least answer one or two of these questions here. The first one that we have coming through is, how does WinMagic, so us essentially, mitigate business email compromise? I think that's pretty straightforward.
Gary, you want to take that?
Well, sure. Business email compromise is often from legitimate email accounts, and the problem and the legitimate email accounts are the problem. There is account takeover. Somebody has gotten the credentials, so that's where MFA, something that strongly resists the phishing, like the FIDO that I just mentioned, comes in.
Okay, I see. So it's about stopping the attack before it has the ability to happen, right? That's what I'm getting.
Right. Yeah, of course, there are things you can do after the fact, but that's the number one thing to stop them from getting in the first place.
For sure. Awesome. And then, so the next one we have here, if we can, I think we can come up with a pretty fast answer for this. In terms, they're essentially asking, can you define MFA and explain how it works at a high level without too much technical jargon? It looks like we have a few audience members that are from a non-technical background.
I'll give a really quick because I know we're over time. So MFA is multi-factor authentication. And with multi-factor authentication, there are three basic factors. Something that you know, that could be a password. Something you have, that could be a USB security key or FIDO security key, or something that you are, that could be biometrics, your face or your finger. And multi-factor combines two or more of those factors to become multi-factor. So it can't be two passwords because that's not multi-factor, but it could be a password and biometrics. That's an example.
Awesome. All right. So with that, I believe that's our wrap up for today. What I will do is thank you all for coming, and we'll do a little bit of a wrap up. So again, thank you all for coming. If we haven't had a chance to get to your question directly, don't worry, a WinMagic rep will be out to reach. We'll be reaching out to you via email to provide an answer again directly. Thank you for taking the time, and we look forward to seeing you at the next edition of the Speed webinar series.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.